and facilities. And once again, let me highlight it. This is something that was raised by the Russian leadership. This attempt of the Ukrainian armed forces to invade our territories from the outset makes it impossible to have any negotiations with the bandit junta, but they still try to impose their ideology to the international community. But that lasted not for a long. After that, Zelensky cynically claimed that Ukraine tries to create some kind of a buffer zone in the Russian region. Nobody among American, French, Italian journalists tried to clarify how one adds to the other. Are you going to set up a buffer zone or to strengthen your negotiating positions? Apparently, Zelensky uses this address to the people to increase his popularity that is plummeting and to increase the funding from Western donors. And certainly, these statements are contradictory. And this criminal plan by the Kiev regime was initially doomed to fail miserably. Meanwhile, the collective West, led by the US, instead of expressing sympathy to women, children, elderly that suffered from the Ukrainian armed forces, continues to actively support the Kiev regime in different ways. Some provide more funds to the Kiev regime for terrorist activities of the Kiev regime, of its officials and those who are the rulers in Ukraine. The others are openly praising terrorist attacks that have been committed. It's not quite clear how it is in line with many laws and myriad legal acts that ban them from funding and supporting terrorist attacks. Take a look at that. Prime Minister of Poland, Donald Tusk, on the 14th of August, went as far as saying that the Kiev regime criminal activities in the Kursk region are defensive, and he recognized that Kiev was entitled to wage a war in such a way as to paralyze Russia as efficiently as possible. How is it in line with the idea of George Bush Jr. That was voiced by him during the conversation with the pranker, that the task of the Kiev regime is to kill as many Russians as possible? There's some kind of a right of the Kiev regime to defend without any restrictions using Finland-supported weapons was raised by the president of this country, Alexander Stubb. There are no geographic limits to use weapons supplied to the Kiev junta, and that is something that was said by Press Secretary of the Defense Ministry of Canada. On the 19th of August, Denmark Foreign Minister Lars Løkke Rasmussen, in his interview with the media, basically gave a green light to the Ukrainian Nazis to use Danish weaponry to strike Russian territory. By doing so, Western leaders basically approved murderous crimes, terrorist attacks committed by the Kiev regime against civilians. On top of that, mentors of the Kiev regime continue to pursue their maniac desire to inflict a strategic defeat upon Russia at all costs. According to Western media, British ministers try to convince NATO allies that it is necessary to allow the Kiev regime to strike Russian territory using cruise missiles Storm Shadow with up to 250 kilometers range. Reportedly, President Biden is open to sending cruise missiles, joint air-to-surface standoff missile, to Kiev. Their range is up to 400 kilometers. Allegedly, Pentagon is working to launch such a lethal weapon from F-16 fighters. Public encouragement of terrorist actions, including in the Kursk region, foreign equipment, military equipment, and mercenaries on our soil showcase vividly that Western allies in the Kiev regime are directly involved in the crimes of neo-Nazis. Against this backdrop, we do understand why Western media, for instance, the Wall Street Journal, started publishing articles that NATO countries, listing various posts and offices, allegedly they do not share intelligence with the Kiev regime on the targets in the Russian territory. Moreover, there are publications that allegedly the West didn't know anything about the plans of Zelensky, but clearly that is not true. These are fake news, these are misleading information, call it as you may. The thing is that the invasion into the Kursk region is taking place with the comprehensive support by the West, and it was authorized by it. The so-called information operations are used by Western media, and by doing so, NATO, including Anglo-Saxons, try to shun away from responsibility from the terrorist acts committed by the Kiev regime. Let me remind you that in the legal system of Anglo-Saxons, there are specific legal acts banning to sponsor terrorism. The sponsorship, support, encouragement of terrorism, it is all banned on an individual basis and collective basis with regard to states and so on. On top of that, these provisions and these definitions, this language is used by the West, and it has been using it for many decades in order to let themselves invade sovereign countries. I'm talking about supporting terrorism by anyone. And this was the fact that gave them the green light and allowed them to breach the law. In order to distance themselves from obviously clear terrorist acts of the Kiev regime, they use media to have an impression that they have nothing to do with the developments, but certainly that is not true. In this context, we drew the attention to the information in late July on the Ukrainian government's work on the bill on international defense companies. Basically, this law legalizes private military companies with foreign engagement. Reportedly, these proxy entities plan to be registered solely in the territories of regions that border our country. If approved, this document will enable NATO countries to send F-16 fighter pilots to Ukraine without any direct involvement in the conflict. Basically, the same old story. First, they use the Kiev regime and Ukraine as a tool. Then they make their utmost to change the law of Ukraine, to hide themselves, to conceal their actions. Should it be implemented, this new form of accomplishing by the West in the criminal activities of Kiev will only prompt further escalation of the conflict. We do not rule out that Ukrainian neo-Nazis consider this law as a green light to use private military companies in Africa and other regions of the global south. Let us warn you that all foreign combatants that are carrying out terrorist attacks against our regions, just like the military equipment of theirs, are legitimate targets of the Russian armed forces, and they will be destroyed. The domestic legislation of the Kiev regime will not give them any protection whatsoever. And we have a new phenomenon. The activities of Western media, namely NATO countries' journalists, with regard to what is currently happening, Western media representatives who are interested, they're not journalists, they are participants to all these smear campaigns in violation of Russian law in the company of Ukrainian terrorists. They are present in the Russian territory. Russian competent authorities introduce criminal charges against them. Namely, we're talking about journalists of Italian TV radio company VAR, and the criminal charge was pressed. In their reports, they made an information shield for terrorist activities of the Kiev regime. They talked with the Ukrainian army officer. They filmed him. He was wearing SS insignia. These were direct SS insignia. Moreover, in these reports, Western journalists told us about alleged care for civilians by the armed forces of Ukraine in the Russian regions. At the same time, for some reason, these Western journalists have not mentioned many cases when terrorists destroyed residential houses using anti-tank mines, shelled from drones. They haven't reported about attacks against civil cars with families and children that tried to flee the area. And the genuine goal behind invasion.
Just me and you. Hershey's Kisses. Say it with a kiss.
Did he call?
नहीं यार, मुझे टेंशन हो रही है. Let me ask एस्ट्रो योगी. बोला है आ जाएगा वापस जब गुस्सा ठंडा हो जाएगा.
वैसे और राइट आ, मुझे भी एस्ट्रो योगी ट्राई करना चाहिए.
अभिषेक.
क्योंकि ज्ञानी तो बहुत हैं, लेकिन योगी सिर्फ एक. एस्ट्रो योगी, असली एडवाइस since 2001.
We're talking about a foreigner and the accreditation of the Russian Foreign Ministry. Now let's get down to the crimes by the Kiev regime. International institutions and media ignore the atrocities of Ukrainian Nazis. They unleashed a deliberate hunt for Russian civilians, including women and children. They tortured them, and that is neglected by everyone. We will do our utmost to make it public. On the 15th of August, in the Belgorod region, the 2 employees of the ambulance crew were targeted by the drone attack. On the 16th of August, there was an attack of the Ukrainian armed forces at the Galactica Mall, full of visitors with children. A fire broke out. Due to deliberate strikes, 11 persons were affected. Terrorists did not allow firemen and first responders to work. They continued deliberate shelling. As a result of the consolidated work of our services, casualties were averted, and the very next day, kamikaze drone strike killed a civilian. On the 17th of August, a large-scale artillery attacks wounded 10 persons, including 2 children, killing a pregnant woman due to a targeted strike at the bus stop of a civilian bus. Attack over the bridge through the same river on the 16th of August killed 2 young Russian volunteers. They selflessly helped that day the local population to evacuate. On the 18th of August, drone attack seriously wounded 2 women in Shebekino due to the drone attack. On the 19th of August, drone strikes injured 1 civilian in the settlement of Borisovka, and 2 persons were injured in the settlement of Malo-Mikhailovka. Terrorists deliberately tried to kill civilians in Russia, and that is showcased by their recent attack in Suja using drone. A car was used by a man and a woman. They tried to evacuate with their 2 nephews, and as a result, children were wounded with a charge filled with metal pellets. A boy had a severe skull injury. He went through an 8-hour surgery where all the NGOs, interstate entities in charge of human rights and protection of children's rights, protection of health. The girl got a knee injury. A fluffy toy saved her from a possible death and even more severe injury. Where's the international community? Where all those international Western magazines and newspapers who put pictures of suffering children on their front cover, and at the same time they turn a blind eye to the suffering of Russian children, of children of other nationalities. What kind of a segregation is here? What kind of a division, inhumane division into classes, categories, and subgroups? The man got multiple shrapnel wounds. Indeed, that is the neo-Nazism of the Kiev regime, pure and simple. At the same time, neo-Nazis have been perpetrating atrocities against Ukrainian citizens. Russian military recorded a cynical killing of 2 exhausted civilians of Volchansk. One of them was wounded already. As people tried to evacuate from the destroyed building, Ukrainian fighters, instead of saving them, cynically fired mines using drone. Monsters from the Ukrainian armed forces put on Nazi paraphernalia, and they made racist insults against elderly men who got lost and who needed help in the Kursk region. It was styled to the SS soldier speech. Apparently, it was not enough for them, and they had to scale up the effect. On the one hand, it is atrocious. We want it never to happen again. On the other hand, there in Paris, in London, in Rome, in Brussels, in Washington, New York, Ottawa, Canberra, people still don't believe that we are talking about outright murderers and terrorists, those who lost their humanity, who deep down profess everything that was previously called fascism, Nazism, racism, xenophobia. And this footage that are posted online become proof that bring people worldwide to senses. That is the proof of animal hatred to people of different nationality that speak their native language. This footage allows us to identify the persons and the whereabouts of those thugs that commit these atrocities. A proof of many barbaric crimes of Ukrainian fighters against civilians in the Kursk region, namely killings, destruction of residential houses, taking hostages of Russian citizens, killings, tortures, looting, just like terrorist attacks in other regions, strikes against the ZNPP. It is carefully recorded. It is considered by Russian investigative bodies, and those terrorists who will not be justly avenged during hostilities will be persecuted without expiry date until they are definitely punished. Luckily, not all Ukrainian military fulfill Zelensky orders without complaint. Recently, it became known that another group of Ukrainian POWs decided to fight as part of the voluntary Bogdan Khmelnytsky battalion that is made up of former Ukrainian servicemen. And this desire not to have anything to do with the Kiev criminals and to be on the right side of history, and we can only welcome that. Indeed, that is a tragedy of Ukrainian people. However, that is also a chance to rehabilitate. Before the previous generations of fathers and grandfathers that protected this land from Nazists and fascists. And that is also a chance and an opportunity to rehabilitate for the future generations.
We have also drawn attention to the recent visit of American Senators Richard Blumenthal and Lindsey Graham to Ukraine. After meeting with Kiev neo-Nazis with their leader, they reported that the letter was decisive to reach a strategic agreement with the U.S. regarding the rare earth materials that pertain to Ukraine. For the the total sum of $1 trillion, but they didn't say something that I would like to say. Namely, that in return to those promises given by American senators, Zelensky received a proposition that he was interested in, but these propositions would be implemented at the expense of Ukrainian citizens that would not return home. That's yet another story of American political elite corruption in the Kiev regime. It is yet another demonstration of the true of the true essence of the Kiev regime. Ukraine doesn't have anything left of its natural resources. At the same time, and it's quite curious, the Ukrainian Rada is now considering a law bill from freeing corrupt politicians from responsibility, from liability. It's a very powerful fact statement, and they continue to revise the history, the Kiev regime. On the 13th of August, in Ivano-Frankovsk, after Poltava, a memorial plaque was opened, dedicated to you won't believe whom. This time, it's not an American figure. It's not something that is not close to Ukraine. It's Johar Dudayev, the person whose hands were covered with blood, who fought on the territory in Chechnya and committed crimes against women and children. Now we have a memorial plaque dedicated to Johar Dudayev. What do we have to expect next? Some kind of a park in a Ukrainian city dedicated to ISIS, which is prohibited, or maybe a cafe dedicated to Al-Qaeda, which is also prohibited. What is going to come next? Maybe a dead end dedicated to Bin Laden. What's the next step that they're going to take? What's the next bottom that they're going to break? Zelensky's team is now seeking new bloody heroes to include them into the quote-unquote pantheon of bloody Nazis. But the bottom line is hatred to Russians, to Russia, to our history, to our culture, to our victories. Ukraine Banderites are ready to commemorate thugs, terrorists, thus confirming their own terrorist essence. In the last 7 days, about 10 monuments were demolished in Ukraine dedicated to Soviet liberators. Let me remind you, they, together with Soviet soldiers, were fighting against Nazism and fascism. Their fathers, grandfathers were fighting against Nazism, and those monuments were erected by Ukrainian Nazism, people who had Ukrainian citizenship. Neo-Nazis also desecrated other memorials in Kharkiv, for example, dedicated to Malinovsky, Konev. As for Belgorod-Dnestrovsk in the Odessa region, the monument to Alexander Pushkin has now been desecrated. As for the Kursk region, those criminals would be prosecuted. On the 13th of August, Ukrposhta hastily presented a design of a post stamp dedicated to terrorist acts of the Ukrainian armed forces in the Kursk region. It presents the moment of when the Russian captives are knelt, quote unquote, before Ukraine. I would like to emphasize that the actions to humiliate our soldiers are violating the Geneva Convention on the Treatment of Prisoners of War of August 12, 1949. Article 13 enshrines that there is guarantee for them to protect them from violence, intimidation, insults. Article 14 says that they have the right to respect for their person and honor. It's not a protection, self-defeat, as the Zelensky says. It's the loss of all values. Another evidence came yesterday. It was another evidence. The Nazi regime of the president, who's not supposed to be the president, uses the help of radicals and schismatics, is trying to destroy the canonical Ukrainian Orthodox Church. They try to capture their religious objects. Metropolitan Arseny is now being held captive for a couple of months now. I think they're fighting for God, obviously. I don't know. Now the junta being encouraged of corresponding agencies. Where's UNESCO, I should ask? We see all kinds of dirty tricks to promote the bill which will prohibit the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. Let me remind you, it's a canonical church, which is the true church that Ukraine has. It was authorized by Zelensky, who I don't know what he believes in. And apologies, I think he also believes in the power of a white powder. It's a satanic action which is aimed at the elimination of the orthodoxy and at deepening the schism, and other representatives of other faiths that are also taking part in this. They're also puppets of this regime. This is a horrendous step, and it violates a range of international documents, international instruments. It violates the laws of the Ukraine itself. All the rights of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church and of millions of parishioners should be restored, and the criminals should be violated. Yesterday, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation published a detailed comment in this regard. This only reiterates the character of Russia's special military operation to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine. We have repeatedly said that all these tasks will be reached. Another topic that Kiev likes to discuss in its international communication is a topic of children. Do you remember when the Kiev regime used far-fetched stories, blamed our countries for stealing children? Let's now take a look at real facts. There is a real case that demonstrates a blatant cynicism of the Kiev regime and a full ignorance to the fates and lives of their own children, of their own citizens. Now I'm talking about minors, underage children. The Kiev authorities decided to repatriate to Ukraine 115 minors from children's home in Verdansk. In March and April, they were turned over to the Italian city of Bergamo in Lombardia. The Ukrainian children were given temporary parents, and it was organized. Education process was organized. I'm not here not talking about Italians who were helping them with clothes. They were helping them to find peace. The Ukrainian consulate in Milan, reached a decision to return kids to Ukraine. Maybe here they're talking about reuniting families, you might say. Maybe they will be given some additional conditions that will educate them, will treat them, raise them well. Don't get your hopes up. We have a Nazi regime in Ukraine. We're talking about children who do not have parents. They were supposed to be given rooms that don't even have basic amenities. It's very hard to talk about this. I hope you realize that. It's not some inhumane behavior. It's those are very horrendous actions. So they're being returned from Lombardia to Ukraine, and this is being done by the representatives of the Kiev regime. They're going to put them into temporary shelters, not designed for children of this age, and then they are supposed to be transported to the US. This is a horrendous crime of the Kiev regime, which allegedly cares for the rights of children, and even blatant propaganda activists from Italian organizations cannot contemplate this situation without fear. They have actually been supporting the Kiev regime over the last couple of years. They don't yet realize how inhumane those actions are of the Kiev regime. Italians, maybe representatives of other countries, will see on their own example, on the example of their own life, that's the case, but they don't understand what we have been talking about for years now. International Criminal Court. Let's talk about this. This body, as I remember, was referring to some documents that don't have any legal basis, any legal foundations, warrants. I don't remember what they call them. They were coupling those documents with the actions of Russia in Ukraine. But do you realize what's happening there? On the 14th of August, local judicial authorities decided to leave the kids there before they can get an asylum. 3 17 years old. The case of the 3 17 years old couldn't be dealt with. They try to reduce they keep to reduce the age for drafting. We started talking about it at the beginning of 2022. That's not the first case. Corresponding agencies are now investigating a Ukrainian citizen who was authorized by Ukrainian consulate in Neapol, is now being blamed for refusing to transport children. She was demanding money from families, and now she's also charged with threat to life and health. That's what the Kiev regime is about. It's not an exception. That's only confirming its essence. That's what we see in real practice, in real life. It's noteworthy that the official Italian authorities have not reacted in any way to these horrendous facts. Why so? The topic of Ukraine has become, to the Italian authorities, the main one. The international organizations in the world, they're promoting Ukrainian interests. Why not comment what's happening to the Ukrainian children? I remember what Italian officials said regarding the warrant of the International Criminal Court. They were given their comments about what's happening. Well, here you have the Ukrainian children. Why don't Ukrainian authorities comment this situation? We do not hear any comments regarding the situation of the telecorporation RAI, an Italian journalist conducts an interview, and
जब वोल्टेज में है आता है जैवलिन मैन ये फेंका ये मारा जैवलिन मैन
इसे एवर रेडी अल्टीमा का लॉन्ग लास्टिंग पावर चाहिए। टॉयज से बच्चों की इमेजिनेशन चलती रहती है, इसलिए इनकी बैटरी चलती रहनी चाहिए। नई एवर रेडी अल्टीमा बैटरी है 400% लॉन्गर लास्टिंग।
कैसे मेरी नब्ज तुम्हारे इशारों पे चमकने लगी,
कैसे मेरी उंगलियां तुम्हारे सिलवटों में ढल गई, बेहिसाब मोहब्बत की कारीगरी, इंद्रिया आदित्य बिरला ज्वेलरी।
of Rome did not allow it. Well, they have to overcome this veto, and everything that is anti-Russian is the narrative of NATO, Washington, London. Well, let's change the situation. The support for the neo-Nazi clique in Kiev, we can see this support and these actions, the support for Italian neo-Nazis is way easier for them as protection of Ukrainian children. We have to open our eyes and see what's happening. Neo-Nazism supported by Western countries, as an example, as for Moldavia, we have celebrated the 80th anniversary when the Moldova was celebrated. Then the Soviet troops liberated the territory of the Moldovan SSR and took to the central part of Romania, and then Bucharest couldn't continue on the side of the Nazis. This operation was included into the textbooks on military art. In August 1944, the Black Sea troops broke the defense of the enemy and closed the encirclement of the German and Romanian army of Ukraine. The Soviet troops defeated 1 million troops.
This allowed the Soviet troops of liberated to fully rid the territory of the enemies, and in those days the Soviet troops showed not only their excellence in leading the battle but also high morale, ready to self-sacrifice, and Lieutenant Alexei Shemegon and Sergeant Alexander Shevchenko repeated the heroic act of Alexander Matrosov. And Alexander Gusev and Kuzma Gorenko died throwing with grenade under the German tanks. All 4 of them were honored with the title of the Soviet hero post-mortem. And in May-August 1944, current Moldovan partisan troops destroyed over 11,000 soldiers and officers of the enemy, 25 enemy tanks, armored vehicles, and derailed 13 military troop trains. Unfortunately, the current Moldovan regime is trying to eradicate those heroic pages of the history, trying to make it so this never happened. And Maya Sandu, who regularly scares people with the so-called Soviet horrors, consistently leads the campaign of blanching the Nazis' supporters. And in the Republic, with the military honors, they're opening monuments for the Romanian heroes. And there are currently the Georgian sign and movies of Great Patriarch were prohibited. And the actions serve as nothing but offense for the liberators, for the memory of their grandparents, great-grandparents. They're not ready to tolerate the ideological ideas that are being imposed, which is showcased by the actions of the voluntary patriotic movements who are trying to rebuild the Soviet memorials, carry out searches. They're trying to organize the memorial actions. And they're carrying out anti-fascist actions, just as their predecessors did, who tried to liberate the Soviet Union. And today, in the 21st century, Moldovans serve as the same anti-fascists. Today, in the so-called peaceful time, and ahead of celebration of the liberation of Moldova, local volunteers organized the events of redesigning the cemetery in the memorial complex of the Serpent Memorial, as well as other memorials all over Moldova. And there will be the Liberation March, which will happen on August 24th along the streets of Chisinau, and will end at the War Memorial of Vechnist. To the memorial campaigns will be joined by the Moldovan diaspora in Russia. On August 17th, 18th, along the streets of Moscow, St. Petersburg, of Moscow and Leningrad region, there has been a festive motor rally, and its participants held the ceremony of wreath-laying along the postments of liberation of Moldova, and the memory of the great patriotic war is alive in the hearts of Moldovans. And we try to support them any way we can, because of course, for a lot of years, people believed that this memory cannot be not only killed or eradicated, it cannot be silenced, but now we understand that the good have to fight as well. Any efforts of the neo-Nazis' revenge are doomed to fail, judging by the decisive nature of the Moldovans. Look at what is happening all over the world. On August 15th, in Japan, there have been events on the so-called Day of the End of War, which once again obviously was the demonstration of the revanchist moods of the official Tokyo. Once again, among pompous words of Japanese political government, there wasn't even a shred of true remorse for the aggression they unleashed. And they have something to show remorse for before the civilians, nor have they been apologies for suffering a substantial material damage caused to the Asian state's civil population. Instead of that, we only heard praises for compatriots dead who died in battle. And in connection with this rather questionable date, since, as we all know, the Second World War ended with the signature of Japanese Act of Surrender on September 2nd, 1945, there have been another mass pilgrimage of Japanese politicians, including 3 acting members of the Cabinet of Ministers, over 70 deputies of the parliament, to the Shinto shrine Yasukuni, odious symbol of militarism, where, among others, they honored Class A war criminals sentenced to death by the judgment of International Military Tribunal for the Far East. So what did the Prime Minister Fumio Kishida do? Once again, he made an oblational donation for the aforementioned temple. This is so like what is currently taking place in the Ministry of Defense in Germany, where they applied new guidelines on how to honor the traditions of German militaries, and the German military fighters received autobiographies of those who they should follow as example of the German soldiers and German fighters. The world is watching in shock and horror when our ministry posted photos and short notices on the life stories of those who current German soldiers should follow as example according to their superiors. Those are SS officers, representatives of the Third Reich, who not only executed orders, they acted on those orders themselves. The so-called heroes of Germany, who received their awards on the battlefields of the East Front, they were killing our soldiers. So going back to Japan, we strongly condemn these practices. Once again, we point out that by doing so, Tokyo is offending the feelings of neighboring countries who fell victim to this barbaric expansionist campaign, and once again demonstrates the current curse of Japanese administration on speeding up remilitarization. We'd like once again to state that Japan, by expanding its military potential, goes against legal limitation in this area. We're continuing to closely follow the steps of Tokyo to expand naval activity near the borders in the Far East, to include extra-regional parties among the NATO member countries, as well as promoting the initiatives of Washington to creating in Asia-Pacific region the narrow bloc associations aimed at ensuring double deterrence of Russia and China. Undoubtedly, such foreign policy course from Japan presents obvious threats for regional stability and security. Especially alarming are their plans to dilute the nuclear weapon-free status of Japan towards joining the so-called joint nuclear missions of the USA, conducting multilateral exercises by using the Allied Strategic Air Force certified to execute nuclear tasks, or discussing the possibilities of storing American medium-range missiles at their territories. And Japan's refusal to join the declared by the previous generations of the politicians peaceful development once again will pose new challenges to the security, will escalate the pressure in the Asia-Pacific region, and will stimulate the new stage of arms race. We once again call on Tokyo to learn lessons from the horrible pages of history, accept the results of the Second World War, and refuse the revanchism and new militarization, which already brought a lot of suffering to the peoples. The Nord Stream is once again in our attention, and the UN Security Council in the last 24 hours touched upon this subject. And there have been different comments of the official representative of the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Germany, Sebastian Fischer. He made this statement during the weekly press conference of the German government on August 19th, where he stated that Berlin apparently exchanges with Russia some information on the terrorist attacks committed in September 2022 on the gas streamlines Nord Stream 1, Nord Stream 2. As you understand, this is not happening, especially considering as a couple weeks ago, his boss, Chancellor Scholz, said that it's Russia who stopped supplying gas to Germany, which in truth, actually the opposite is taking place. Russia is prepared to do it, and we've mentioned it repeatedly, even in the interviews with German mass media. Russia has never stood in the way of supplying their energy resources, of supplying our gas to Germany. And should such decisions be made, it could happen within a month. So any absurdity is very predictable when we hear it from the official German representatives, but we will continue to comment on that. But by making such a statement, the German side probably tried to question the legitimacy of complaints that we presented to the German authorities as for their refusal to cooperate with investigating this crime of an international scale, because it not only took place on the European continent, but on the territory of several countries of the European continent. And it happened in the violation of the subsequent anti-terrorist UN conventions. And Germany, by refusing to cooperate, also serves in violation of these conventions. It's also worth noting that the words of Mr. Fischer are of no truth at all. So let us state this as simple as possible so the Germans can translate it properly. It's a lie. For over 2 years, all the requests of our competent authorities as for the attacks on the Nord Streams, we only receive empty excuses from the German side. Not a single so-called document that was sent our way contained any factological information. Not for the first time, Berlin is trying to convince everyone in international diplomatic society that supposedly they're complying with all the obligations of the international law. Not only that, they're trying to feed to the international community this so-called bureaucratic pile instead of complying with their obligation. It's nothing but lies. They supply no facts that they have on the investigation, and they never supplied any facts to our side. And Russia insists on holding official bilateral consultations in line with current guidelines that are already enshrined in anti-terrorist UN conventions. And we would like Mr. Fischer, or perhaps his bosses, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, or perhaps the Chancellor of Germany, to speak if they're actually committed with fulfilling obligations of the UN anti-terrorist conventions. The statement of the representative of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Germany only reaffirms our suspicions that Berlin is trying to hide the actual investigation, trying to do anything so that we don't understand who exactly planned the attack on the largest trans-European object of energetic infrastructure, which is especially important for Germany itself. And as for the repercussions of the German mass medias for trying to establish the truth in the energetic security, I think is another testament that once again Berlin has something to hide, and they have no interest of conducting a true investigation and unleashing the real information, the truth. There have been a lot of questions. I'd like to comment additionally. On August 19th, there has been information on including of the stop list representatives of 9 British analytic structures through publicly available mass media and on the internet. These organizations spread in the international informational space misinformation, discrediting the Russian state, and over the years they're trying to no avail, but they're still trying to create conditions to destabilize internal political situation in our country, and not only in Russia but in our friendly countries. They subsequently participate in information campaign to support the Nazi regime in Kiev. We continue to oversee these dangerous work of British authorities against our countries, and including in the Russian counter-sanction list the heads of the most aggressive British propaganda structures, and the work on expanding the Russian stop list will continue. And of course, over this time, over the last 10 days, were addressed to us around the situation of the Olympics in Paris. And for several reasons, the refusal to let participate certain athletes, the segregation of athletes, horrific performances that took place during the opening ceremony and the closing ceremony, the discrimination as a whole of athletes. We've commented at length. And of course, discrimination against journalists who report on the events of the Olympics, and we've commented on this regularly, but summarizing all the questions that we've received, I would like to comment on this a little more. Millions of people around the world were shocked by the scandalous episodes of the closing ceremony of the Olympics, and I believe this is how it will go down in history, as a scandal. And the main question that both political representatives, the leaders of countries, high guests, was the following. Why the sports, and this is the event commemorating the sports, this is the sport event, why the sport had to take a step back in order to welcome the ideology. And nobody even questions what kind of ideology is this. It's the liberational ideology. But the sporting event was filled with this ideological side. And there are a lot of proof and evidence to that, starting with athletes not being allowed to participate based on their nationality, to offending religious beliefs, to segregating journalists, politicized and ideological component of the history of the made-up gender issue, and the games themselves took place with a lot of violations. Everyone could see for themselves how unfit the water was in the Seine. During the opening day, there have been disruptions in the transportation systems. Athletes reported on the Spartan conditions of living in the Olympic Village. As for the Russian participation, a lot of experts agree that without the Russian Olympic team, a lot of types of sport lost in spectator aspect and the level of participation. And it's not only the world community who lost, spectators who lost, athletes who lost. The ideological aspect, the segregation which reaped through every decision of the International Olympic Committee. And it's obvious not only to our country but to everyone. And the president of the International Olympic Committee, Mr. Bach, closely followed his Western curators. His actions divided the international sport. They're undermining the sport as a whole. Imagine someone who watched the Olympics for the first time. Now they have a disrupted vision of what a true Olympic movement stands for. And the International Olympic Committee took away Russian and Belarusian athletes' dreams to participate in the Olympic Games, to represent their countries. And back together with the Kiev regime, conducted close following of Russians on social media, presented psychological pressure on athletes. There was blatant discrimination.
There were cases when IOC representatives proposed to Russian sporting federations to replace athletes that got Olympic licenses for somebody that was not selected without any clarification. Besides that, the advocate of the new normality and new inclusivity, namely Thomas Bach, made atrocious comments on gender issues that are anti-scientific, anti-social. He also made dubious decisions on accessing of women boxers that have failed gender tests. He made blatant lies towards International Boxing Association. It's up to experts to deal with that. Just like